Welcome to this presentation of Cheshire's Incorporation and the Shape It's In by Barry Emery. This is an outline of the village of the town of Cheshire. And running through it is that red line of the Appalachian Trail. And after I retired, one of the things I wanted to do was hike on part of that trail. So I walked up to the point where the blue arrow is indicating, and that's near the Cheshire Cobbles, very popular lookout. And when I was up there, I thought, I think I'll look for that corner marker. Is it a sign? Is it a pile of stones? Or what is it? And I could not find it. I ended up going back 2 more times and still was never able to find that any kind of marker. And that set me off on some research to try to find out how are towns' boundaries marked and could I find Cheshire's. And in this presentation, we're going to talk about why there is a town called Cheshire. New Providence was originally settled from men and families from Rhode Island. And why did it become the town of Cheshire? And how many corners does Cheshire have? Why has the number changed over the years? Is there some sort of marker at each corner? And why is Cheshire shaped like a minuteman? Well, let's take a look first at an old map of Berkshire County. And you can see in the center where the yellow oval is, the little section called New Providence. And that was settled in the 1760s. And in 1776, when the revolution began, those men fought very hard in the revolution. And they wanted to become a town. They wanted to be incorporated so that they could have a say in the state government. It took 17 years before that finally happened. This chart shows all the major events that happened over that timeline. I'll talk about just the major ones very briefly. The first time we tried to become a town of Cheshire was when Windsor wanted to change their name from Gageborough to Windsor. Gageborough was a British general, and during the Revolution, that was not a good name to have for a town. Well, that got voted down by the state legislature. The next year, we tried again with Adams, and that also was voted down by the state legislature. The third attempt to become a town was also with Adams. And actually, the first time Adams voted yes to accept New Providence, and the next time, and then a month or 2 later, they voted no. And then finally, the word didn't get back to the State House, and so the State House voted yes. And we just became a part of Adams. And we stayed that way for 13 years. But finally, on March 14th, parts of Adams, New Ashford, Windsor, and Lanesborough all were incorporated into the town of Cheshire. Here's how the act read. An act for incorporating a part of the towns of Lanesborough, Windsor, Adams, and the district of New Ashford in the county of Berkshire into a town by the name of Cheshire. Notice how the S's look like an F in most of those words. The act was passed March 14th, 1793. Now, the original boundary was marked out using surveying methods at the time. And if you read along with me, it was marked, the corners were marked with stones. And here's how it read. Thence south 31 degrees west, 160 rods to a stake and stones. Thence east 16 degrees south, 100 rods to a stake and stones. Thence south 31 degrees west, etc., etc. At one point in the description, they even use a birch tree as a corner marker with some stones about it. So how many corners did they come up with when they created that town out of the 4 sections of other communities. Well, I took the description that we just started reading, and one by one, I went on a piece of graph paper with a protractor and drew out the lines to scale. And each of these lines represents one of those descriptions. The next one is south, 31 degrees west, 320 rods. The next one is east, 16 degrees south, 400 rods to a stake. And when I finished drawing, here's what I came up with. And then when I back and numbered all the corners, there's 20 of them. So on March 14th, 1793, Cheshire had 20 corners. And this is the shape that it was in. Now it changed about a year later. And here's what happened. The section that's inside of that oval had a rectangle that originally was given to Cheshire, but the farmers in that area wanted to belong to Windsor. And so they petitioned the state to go back to the town of Windsor. And so that little section there where the dashed lines are was given back to the town of Windsor. At that point, Cheshire then had 22 corners. Here's a section of this map, by the way, where there was a crease in the fabric. And I'm going to show you some examples of where no one could count the number of corners correctly. And the fact that those creases caused disruptions in the lines is part of the problem. The second change to the shape of Cheshire was in 1798. A man by the name of Jacob Cole had a farm, and he wanted to become part of Cheshire. By the way, look at how the word possession is shown using the old script. If we read the act, or part of it anyway, it says, an act to set off the part of the farm in possession of Jacob Cole, which lies in the district of New Ashford, to the town of Cheshire. So in 1798, the shape was changed again. This time in the northern boundary, a rectangle jutted north, and that was the farm of Jacob Cole. It looks like a little chimney sticking up at the top of Cheshire. And it added 3 corners. So Cheshire now had 25 corners. This map is from 1858. Here's an example of somebody counting the corners incorrectly. This article from 1926 says Cheshire holds corner on corners, 26 angles in its boundary line. And one of the places where they made a mistake is inside of that oval on the left. And they counted an extra corner there. And that was because of a crease in a map that caused the confusion. The correct way that it should show is on the right. Here's another example of a mistake on a map. This is from 1830, and they left out Jacob Cole's section completely. And here's a big map of Berkshire County showing those creases. And one of them, if we zoom in, is right there where that mistake was made, as I showed you earlier. This was also a map that on the southern boundary used a stream as the boundary line, which was totally incorrect. Another example of a map showing that section where that crease caused confusion. The third and final change happened in 1912. An act to establish the boundary line between the towns of New Ashford and Cheshire. What happened was they were surveying the Mount Greylock State Reservation area. And in so doing, the legislature decided to give that section that was Jacob Cole's farm back to New Ashford and resort Cheshire back to its original northern boundary line. And therefore, Cheshire no longer has that chimney shape along the top north boundary. And we're back to 22 corners. And we have 22 corners as of today. And there's the original map that I had drawn out from that description. And it also has 22 corners. So starting from 1793, when we gave back that section to Windsor, we had 22 corners. This is from the History of Western Mass, written in 1925. The real true map of the county of Berkshire shows a subdivision of it as being curiously shaped with 25 angles in its boundary, perhaps more angles than found in any other town in America. Well, we had already given back Jacob Cole's farm, so at that time we had 22 corners, and we certainly weren't the most crooked town in the country. In fact, we weren't even the most crooked town in Massachusetts. West Brookfield has 37 corners. And if you look at a map of Berkshire County, you'll see that Lenox has more corners than Cheshire. We were rather oddly shaped, though. Most of the towns in Berkshire County are sort of rectangular, and their boundary lines are pretty straight lines. Why are we shaped so funny? And how are the corners marked today? Well, this is from the 1913 State Survey describing boundaries of towns. Here's the description of the Cheshire-Windsor corner. The corner is situated 4 feet westerly of a wire fence on the westerly slope of a hill in heavy woodland, about 150 feet southwesterly of a clearing. The corner mark is a rough field stone, 4 feet 9 inches high and about 5.5 by 8 inches in section. The letter W is cut on the south face and C on the west face and C on the north face. By the way, those descriptions in 1913 were no longer accurate when I started looking for them. Many fields were now heavily wooded, and wooded areas had been turned into fields. So it was very difficult to use the descriptions to find these stones. Here's that stone that we just described. When we found it, it was tipped over. And I should say that my friend Rick Salvi came with me on these hikes as we tried to find these corner markers. And when we found one that was tipped over like this one, we tried to straighten it out. The way we found them was I found this state document that showed the latitude and longitude of the corners. And using a GPS, we were able to follow a track until we got to that location. In this case, we found 2 stones that day. We went to a Cheshire-Windsor stone on the left, and then we went to another Cheshire-Windsor corner on the right. Those are up on Richmond Hill Road. Other times when we hiked, it was a little more difficult, and we took a long time to get to a particular stone. It might have been the terrain that caused us to loop back and forth, but eventually we found what we were looking for. Sometimes it was a very steep climb. Other times we were going over barbed wire fences and through woods. This is the stone corner in Cheshire, Lanesborough. We have 4 corners. This is the 4th corner. And here's how we found the stone originally on the left. It was in 2 pieces. It had been broken in half. And so what we did is figure out which piece was the original one in the ground. And then we stood the other piece up next to it, as you can see on the right, and we tied a blue ribbon around it and piled some stones around it so that it would hopefully remain upright. Here's another stone that was interesting. It's the only one that had this kind of a poster on a tree next to it. Please do not disturb nearby survey marker. And we wrote on it that on September 2011, B. Emery and R. Salvi checked on this marker. And the perambulation law requires that when you do check a marker, that you put on the face of the stone the date and the person who checked it. And that's why someone had written Alex and we had written Cheshire 2011 Emery Salvi. Here's another stone that had been replaced by someone prior to us. It's the Cheshire Dalton Windsor corner. And you can see the broken stone lies at the base and the new stone is upright. We simply piled the old stone up and took a picture so you could see the markings on it. This is the stone that had the oldest date. It's a Cheshire Savoy corner number 2. And the date on it is 1839. So at some point, all those piles of stones that were described in the original Act of 1793 were replaced. A close-up of that stone showing the script S, that corner faces Savoy, and the date of 1839. This was one of the larger stones, and it was tipped over at an angle. And all Rick and I did was straighten it up. Cheshire Savoy, corner number 1. That stone was placed in 1855. There's the C for the face of the stone pointing towards Cheshire. This stone, the Adams Cheshire Savoy corner, was described like this in 1913. The corner is situated about 50 feet west of and about 40 feet higher than Tophet Brook, in a heavily woodland about 200 feet south of a cleared land. The corner mark is a slab of common fieldstone leaning against the southerly side of a large beech tree on which numerous initials and dates are cut. The stone slab is 3 to 4 feet high and about 14.5 inches in section. The letter C is cut on the north face and S on the south face. Well, when we found the stone, here's what it looked like. The beech tree had been cut down, so we couldn't find any initials on it. And the slab of stone was just on the ground leaning up against the tree. We stood it upright and put some other stones at the base to try to hold it up. This stone was one of the hardest ones to find. It's the corner of Adams, Cheshire, and New Ashford. The arrow on the left points to where it is. It's up on top of Mount Greylock in a heavily wooded area. It's a nice looking stone with the initials carved on each face for the town that it's facing. And here's a stone from Cheshire Savoy Windsor corner. It was tipped over, but it was so large we could not lift it up, or at least I could not lift, Rick and I could not lift it up. I'm pointing to that stone, and it goes all the way back behind where I'm kneeling. It was put there in 1911. Well, I got a couple of my friends to come with me, and we were able to finally stand it up. And the people that did the surveying in 1913 also took a photograph of this stone. And I found that old photograph in the Massachusetts Historic Archives in Boston. It's a little hard to see the stone because of the birch trees and the shadows, but it's inside that rectangle. And you can see the pointed shape on it. So finally, we're back to the stone I tried to find initially, Cheshire Dalton, corner number 1, up on the Appalachian Trail. It ended up being the last stone that we found. And here's what we saw when we found it. It had been broken into 4 pieces, and it's just off the Appalachian Trail, but it's maybe 20 feet off the trail, and it's in some brush. So because it wasn't standing up straight, it was very difficult to find. You would not see it just walking along the trail. What we did is put a rock pile around it and try to stand up the biggest piece, put ribbons around it so that at least it became more visible. We knew where to put it because the base of that stone was still in the ground. And that's what it looks like today if you were to go up there and find it. Now, there's a Massachusetts general law, excuse me, about town boundaries. It reads like this in section 2. The boundary markers of every town shall be located, the marks therein renewed, and the year located marked upon the face thereof, which bears the letter of the town locating its boundary, once every 5 years, by at least 2 of the selectmen of the town, or by 2 substitutes designated by them in writing. The marking shall be made with a paint or other suitable marking material. Well, Cheshire had not checked on its boundaries since the 1920s, and there is a fine for not doing it. When I pointed out to the selectmen that Rick and I had this project of finding the boundary markers, they immediately took a vote and sent me this letter. It was a pleasure to review with you your efforts of walking Cheshire boundaries to perambulate the boundaries of our town. The Board of Selectmen would like to appoint you and Richard Salvery as the perambulators for the town of Cheshire, Mass. Your efforts are greatly appreciated. Please stop in and have the town clerk, Christine Emerson, swear you in. So we became the official town perambulators. And here's a definition what a perambulator is. Perambulation means walking around in traditional English law. It is used specifically to mean determining the bounds of a legal area by walking around it, meaning physically walking around the region in question. The North Adams Transcript had done an article of us in 2011 when we were doing this project, and that's Rick and I standing up one of the stones. I should mention the 2 guys that helped me stand that other stone up in Windsor were Ron Whitmarsh and Jim Pyra. So thank you for their help. Last topic for us to discuss is the shape of Cheshire. Well, during the American Revolution, there were a group of volunteers known as minutemen, and they had a very distinctive part of the uniform known as the tri-corner hat. And if we look at the shape of Cheshire and you use your imagination, with the Minuteman looking to the left, his nose and chin on the left border, his neck down below, and even the bun of the hair sticking off to the right. You might think that maybe we were purposely shaped to look like a Minuteman. But actually, there's another reason. When Cheshire was incorporated, we took New Providence, which was part of Adams, and we took part of Lanesborough, and we took part of Gageborough, which was at the time Windsor. And if I put our shape over that map of Berkshire County, you can see how we incorporated parts of those communities. Well, especially in Lanesborough, on the western border, where this oval is, the boundary was moved according to religious purposes. If a farmer was a Baptist, they stayed in Cheshire. If they were not, they went back, they stayed in Lanesborough. Lanesborough had a Presbyterian church and an Episcopal church, and Cheshire had a Baptist church. And it was very important that you lived in the town that had the meeting house of your religion. And therefore, that boundary, which is shaped the way it is, was drawn because of religion. The History of Cheshire, written in 1885, says it this way. It is said that in laying out the town, the western line was drawn with reference to religious views of the settlers, taking the farms of the Baptist families into Cheshire and leaving the Presbyterians in Lanesborough, thus giving that boundary much the appearance of a rail fence. So we're shaped because of religious purposes back in 1793. And all of that is in my book, The History of Cheshire's Incorporation and the Shape It's In. What is in this presentation is in there along with some more details. And when I was doing the research for that book, I came across some interesting mysteries and wrote a second book called Historical Mysteries of Cheshire. I later wrote a book called Made in Cheshire, which talks about our industry. We were very famous as an industrial town back in the 1800s. To the right is a fictional book that I wrote called Brooklyn Comes to Cheshire. When I gave a talk about historical homes in town, someone told me there was a rumor about prostitutes in the Greylock Villa mansion. I ended up writing a book based on that rumor. And then down below on the left is my book about the Mammoth Cheese, When America Watched Cheshire, a very famous historical event in town from 1801 and 1802. And then on the right is my latest book, What Is and What Was, Historical Virtual Tour of Cheshire, where on the left side of the page, you'll see what you would see today. And on the right side of the page is a photograph of what that view would look like 150 or 200 years ago. So I hope you enjoyed learning about Cheshire's Incorporation. Thank you for listening. If you would like to know any more about the subject, don't hesitate to email me. I'd be happy to answer questions, and you can order books by emailing me at emery395@gmail.com. Thank you.